Three men drove out of the Ozark National Forest with a DOGMAN pup wrapped in a feed sack in the bed of their truck, and by the next morning, only one of them was alive to talk about what came looking for it. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from, and if you've had an encounter like this. The man who told us this story agreed to talk on one condition: no real names. We will call him Roy. He was not one of the three men in that truck. He was the game warden who found what was left of the camp 2 days later, and once you hear what he found, you will understand why he does not want his name attached to any of it. Roy spent the better part of 3 decades as a conservation officer for the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission, working the district that covers the Sylamore Ranger District of the Ozark Francis National Forest in Stone and Izard counties. That is rugged country. Limestone bluffs cut by spring-fed creeks, oak and hickory ridges rising 1,000 feet above the White River, and hollows so tight and so overgrown that a man can walk within 30 yards of another man and never know he is there. Roy knew that district, the way a rancher knows his fence line. He had worked deer season poaching cases, timber theft, ginseng diggers stripping public land, and the occasional black bear killed out of season and left to rot because the poacher panicked when he realized what the fine would be. He had seen the worst of what people do to wildlife in that forest. He had never seen anything like what he found in October of a year he asked us not to specify beyond saying it was within the last decade. The 3 men were from a hollow outside 56 Arkansas, a wide spot on Highway 14, ivy thin on both sides, the kind of place that shows up on a map because the map has to put something there. We will call them Grady, Chester, and a younger man named Milt. Grady was the one who organized things. He was in his early 50s, ran a small logging operation on the side, and had a reputation in the county for taking things out of the forest that were not his to take. Ginseng, out of season, bear gallbladders sold to buyers who moved them overseas. He had been cited twice by Roy's department for baiting deer, and both times the fine had been small enough that it did not change his behavior. Chester was Grady's brother-in-law, a man in his 40s who worked at a sawmill in Mountain View and helped Grady on weekends. Milt was Chester's nephew, 22 years old, along for reasons nobody Roy talked to afterward could fully explain. Maybe money, maybe just to be included. What Grady was after that October was not ginseng or bear parts. It was something that does not belong in any wildlife trafficking case file, and the fact that it exists in this one is why the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission has never released a public report on what happened to these 3 men. Grady had heard, through the kind of backwoods rumor network that moves faster than any official channel, that something was denning in a bluff shelter off one of the feeder hollows above Blanchard Springs, something people in that part of Stone County had been calling a dogman for 2 generations. Ever since a Forest Service trail crew claimed to have seen an upright, canine-headed animal cross a fire road in the 1970s. The story had never made a newspaper. It lived the way these stories live in the Ozarks. Passed at deer camp, mentioned once, and then dropped. Never quite believed, and never quite dismissed. Grady did not care whether it was real in the way a biologist would define real. He cared that a man he knew in Missouri, a private collector with money and no scruples about where his money came from, had told him that a verified cryptid specimen, dead or alive, would be worth more than anything Grady could pull out of that forest in 10 years of ginseng digging. A live pup would be worth more than a dead adult. That was the calculation. Grady had spent weeks scouting the hollow. Using a spotlight and a game camera he mounted on a cedar tree above a limestone overhang that showed signs of denning activity. Roy would later find that camera. What was on the card is part of why he never filed a full report. The overhang sat about 400 vertical feet above Blanchard Springs Creek, on Forest Service land inside the Sylamore district, reached by a spur off an old CCC-era fire road that had not been graded in years. It faced south, protected from prevailing weather, with a floor of dry sand and a ceiling low enough in the back that a grown man would have to crouch. Bear used bluff shelters like this one throughout the Ozarks for winter denning. Bobcat used them for raising kittens. This one showed neither. What Grady's camera caught, over 11 days of monitoring in late September, was a series of thermal-triggered nighttime clips, showing an adult animal entering and leaving the shelter on 2 legs, and on 3 of those nights, something smaller moving near the entrance while the adult was away. Grady made his decision on a Tuesday night in early October. He picked a night when his camera showed the adult had left the shelter 3 hours earlier, a pattern that had repeated 4 times over the previous 2 weeks, always around 8 in the evening, always gone until sometime after 2 in the morning. He assumed it was a hunting circuit, regular, predictable, the kind of pattern any trapper learns to read and exploit. He was right about the pattern. He was wrong about what predictability meant coming from something that could think. The 3 men hiked in after dark with headlamps taped over with red cellophane to cut the visible light, a trick Grady used for spotlighting deer that he adapted for this. They carried a livestock crate, a cattle prod, 2 rifles, and a feed sack. Chester stayed at the base of the bluff with the truck keys and a rifle, watching the fire road. Milt and Grady climbed the talus slope to the shelter entrance. What happened inside that shelter, Roy pieced together over the following months from 3 sources. Milt's own account, given to Roy in a state that Roy described as barely coherent. 2 days after the fact, the physical evidence at the scene, and the game camera card, which continued recording for 1 more night before it was torn off the tree. Milt said the pup was alone in the back of the shelter, curled against the rock wall, and it did not run. He said it was roughly the size of a large dog, maybe 2.5 feet at the shoulder, with the proportions of something built to stand upright but too young to have grown into that build yet. Dark fur, already coarse. Milt said it made a sound when the light hit it, not a bark and not a whine, something with more structure to it. 3 or 4 distinct tones that it repeated as Grady closed the crate around it. Milt said that sound was the thing he could not stop hearing afterward.
Quick thing before we move on, I have this book coming out. It's called the DOGMAN Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. Been working on it for a long time. So if you want to check that out, links down below. Now let's get you back to the video.
They got the crate down the talus slope faster than they should have been able to. Adrenaline carrying weight that good sense would have made them respect more. They loaded it into the truck bed, covered it with a tarp, and were on the fire road inside 20 minutes of entering the shelter. Grady thought that was fast enough. He had built his entire plan around being fast enough. He had not accounted for the possibility that the adult's absence was not incidental to the hunting circuit. He had not considered that an animal capable of avoiding a game camera's obvious mounting angle for 11 straight nights, an animal that had clearly noticed the camera and chosen not to react to it, might also have noticed 3 men watching a bluff shelter from a ridge above the creek for 2 weeks running, and might have altered its own schedule specifically to observe what they would do next. If you know the Sylamore district, the country around Blanchard Springs, Caverns, and the North Sylamore Creek watershed, you know how a sound carries in those hollows at night, how a limestone bluff throws an echo back at you that makes you unable to tell which direction it came from. Let us know in the comments if you have ever spent a night in that part of Stone County and heard something you could not place, because the reports coming out of that watershed go back a lot further than 3 poachers and a feed sack. Chester was waiting at the truck when Milt and Grady came down the slope with the crate. He told Roy, in the one conversation Roy managed to have with him before Chester stopped answering his phone entirely, that he had heard something on the ridge above the shelter in the final minutes before the other 2 reached the road. A sound low enough that he felt it in his chest before he consciously registered hearing it. 3 descending tones that repeated once, then went quiet. He said at the time he told himself it was an owl. He said by the time Milt and Grady reached the truck, he already knew it was not. They drove the 11 miles back to Grady's property, a 40-acre parcel with a double-wide and a pole barn set back from a gravel county road outside 56. Grady's plan was to hold the pup overnight in a horse stall in the pole barn, contact the Missouri buyer in the morning, and arrange a handoff within the week. He had reinforced the stall himself 2 days earlier, welding a steel mesh panel over the top of an 8-foot stock partition, confident that whatever they caught, a mesh panel and 8 feet of vertical clearance would hold it. The pup screamed for most of the first hour after they left it in the barn. Milt said it was the sound from the shelter, the same 3 or 4 tones, but louder and more sustained, cycling over and over. Grady told him to shut the barn doors and go inside. Milt said he could still hear it from the house, muffled through 2 closed doors and 40 yards of yard, until sometime around midnight when it stopped. It did not stop because the pup calmed down. Roy determined that later from the blood evidence in the stall. It stopped because something reached through the mesh panel Grady had welded across the top of the partition, tore a section of it loose with enough force to bend half-inch steel rod like coat hanger wire, and took the pup out. None of the 3 men in the house heard it happen. That detail matters more than almost anything else in this account, because it tells you something about what was capable of doing this. A pole barn 40 yards from an occupied house, 3 adult men inside that house, one of them a light sleeper by his own account, and whatever came for that pup entered the property, tore open welded steel, retrieved the animal, and left again without generating a single sound loud enough to wake anyone. Grady found the barn empty at first light. The stall gate was still latched. The mesh panel was peeled back at one corner like the lid of a sardine can. The steel rod bent outward and down, not torn or snapped, bent, which meant sustained force applied with control rather than a frantic, thrashing struggle. There was blood on the straw, not a large quantity, consistent with the pup's own minor injuries from being crated and handled roughly the night before, not consistent with anything having been killed inside that stall. The pup itself, or its remains, were never found on the property. It had simply been extracted and removed. Grady's reaction, according to what Milt told Roy 2 days later, was not fear. It was frustration. He had lost the specimen he intended to sell, and his first instinct was that another poacher or a rival buyer had somehow found out and beaten him to it. He walked the property line looking for vehicle tracks. He found none. What he found instead, at the tree line 40 yards behind the pole barn, were tracks in the dew-softened grass, large, bipedal, 5-toed, the stride length stretching close to 5 feet between prints. The tracks came out of the woods, crossed the open pasture directly to the barn, and returned the same way, in a line so straight it looked surveyed. Grady did not call Roy's office that morning. He did not call anyone. What he did, according to Milt, was decide that whatever had taken the pup back was an animal reclaiming its offspring, and that the danger, if there was any, had left with it. He told Chester and Milt to keep their mouths shut, cleaned up the barn, and went about his day as though the previous night had been an inconvenience rather than a warning. That decision is the reason 2 of those 3 men are dead. Roy did not get involved until 2 days later, when a hunter scouting for the upcoming bow season found a truck abandoned on a Forest Service spur road not far from the Blanchard Springs shelter. Driver's door open, keys in the ignition. No one inside. The hunter called it in as a possible medical emergency or a stranded motorist. Roy was the officer who responded, because the location fell inside his patrol district. He recognized the truck. It belonged to Grady. Roy had sighted him twice before and knew the vehicle on sight. He radioed for backup from the Stone County Sheriff's Office and began working the scene the way he had been trained to work any welfare check involving an abandoned vehicle in remote forest terrain. Check for signs of the owner, check the immediate area, expand the search radius if nothing turns up quickly. What Roy found within the first 100 yards of the truck was enough that he requested the sheriff's department escalate the response before he had gone any farther. Grady's rifle was lying in the roadway, 40 feet from the truck, safety still on, unfired. There was a boot, a man's size 11 work boot, lying separately from any body, 20 yards off the road in the brush, the leather torn rather than cut, the kind of damage that comes from something pulling a foot free of a boot with enough force that the boot itself failed before the foot came loose. They found Grady's body around midday, roughly 300 yards from the truck, in a drainage that fed down toward the creek. Roy will not describe the specific condition of the remains beyond confirming, when pressed by the sheriff's investigator who took point on the case, that the cause of death was consistent with blunt force and laceration trauma inconsistent with any weapon, and that the post-mortem examination noted bite and puncture patterns. The medical examiner's report described only as consistent with a large canid of a size and dentition that could not be matched to any species native to Arkansas. That phrase, could not be matched to any species native to Arkansas, is a direct quote from the report, and Roy has seen it, because as the responding officer he was copied on the file before it was sealed. Chester was found the following day, nearly a mile from the truck, in terrain so steep that the search team needed rope assistance to reach the body. The distance and the terrain told Roy that Chester had been alive and moving after whatever attacked Grady, that he had run, and that the thing that killed him had followed him nearly a mile through some of the roughest ground in the Sylamore district before catching him. Roy said that detail bothered him more than almost anything else about the case. A mile of flight through bluffs and cane thickets is not survivable running from anything in the Ozarks that biology currently accounts for. Whatever caught Chester did not lose him in the terrain the way a black bear would. Lumbering and short-winded, it kept pace, or closed distance steadily, over ground that would exhaust a trained search and rescue team. Milt was found alive. He had made it back to the truck, tried the door, found it already open with the keys inside, and by his own later account did not remember driving because he never actually left. He was sitting in the driver's seat, engine off, when the hunter found the truck 2 days later, in a state of shock severe enough that he was transported directly to a hospital in Batesville rather than being questioned on scene. He had scratches across his back and shoulders that the treating physician documented as superficial, defensive in pattern, consistent with something having had the opportunity to kill him and choosing not to complete the act. That detail is the one Roy comes back to more than any other when he talks about this case, which by his own admission is rarely, and only under conditions where he trusts the person he is talking to. Grady died. Chester died, after a chase that should not have been survivable by the pursuer's endurance alone, let alone possible to sustain at pace. Milt lived, marked but not killed, the only one of the three who had not personally handled the pup once it was in the crate, the only one who Roy believes never touched it at all beyond helping carry the crate itself. Roy is not a man given to speculation. 30 years of wildlife law enforcement teaches you to document what you find and let the evidence speak for itself. But he told us that the pattern in front of him, one man dead near the vehicle, one man dead after a pursuit that covered nearly a mile of the worst ground in the county, and one man alive with wounds that read as a warning rather than an attempt, was not random. It read to him the way a deliberate accounting reads. Something had assessed 3 men's individual culpability and delivered a response scaled to what each of them had done. The Sheriff's Department's official case file, which Roy has seen but cannot legally share, attributes the deaths to an animal attack, species undetermined, and recommends increased caution for hikers and hunters in the area pending further investigation. There has been no further investigation. The Arkansas Game and Fish Commission, Roy's own employer, closed its portion of the file within a month, citing the case as outside the department's jurisdiction, once the sheriff's office classified it as a homicide investigation pending animal identification, a classification that effectively moved the case into a bureaucratic gap where no single agency owns responsibility for pursuing it further. Nobody wants to be the agency that spent public funds investigating a cryptid attack. The file exists. It sits. Nobody touches it. Roy went back to the Bluff shelter 3 weeks after the deaths, on his own time, not on department business. He wanted to see the site itself, away from the noise of the search and the sheriff's investigation, to try to understand what he was actually dealing with in his own district. He found the shelter empty, no sign of continued denning use. The game camera Grady had mounted was gone, the mounting bracket still screwed into the cedar tree, but the camera housing itself missing entirely. No scratch marks or broken hardware, as if it had been removed deliberately rather than torn off. He found something else at the shelter that he has never fully explained to anyone outside a small circle of trust, and that he described to us only after we agreed not to pin down the exact drainage. Scratched into the soft limestone at the back of the shelter, at a height he estimated around 6.5 feet, were 4 parallel gouges, fresh, the stone beneath them pale where the weathered surface had been cut away. He had seen bear claw marks on trees his entire career. This was not that. The spacing was too wide, the depth too uniform, and it was cut into rock, not bark, which no black bear in Arkansas has the claw structure to accomplish. The Ozarks carry an old weight when it comes to stories like this, and it predates any radio prank or internet forum. The Osage Nation, whose traditional territory once extended across much of what is now the Arkansas Ozarks before removal pushed them into Oklahoma in the 1820s, held oral traditions describing beings associated with high bluffs and cave systems, beings that were spoken of carefully and specifically not sought out. The details of those traditions belong to the Osage Nation and are not mine to reconstruct or embellish. But the general pattern, a being tied to a specific rugged territory, approached with deliberate caution rather than curiosity, shows up consistently enough across documented Ozark folklore that it is not something a modern retelling invented. Early Ozark settler accounts from the 1800s, collected later by folklorists working in Missouri and Arkansas, describe what settlers called wild men or shadow beasts in the same bluff and cave country that runs through Stone, Izard, and Searcy counties, described in terms that, stripped of period language, sound very much like what Grady's camera recorded. Linda Godfrey's decades of documented dogman cases establish a consistent behavioral baseline that this incident fits without deviation. Territorial defense escalating in proportion to provocation, restraint toward humans who pose no direct threat, willingness to abandon that restraint entirely when offspring are threatened. What separates the Ozark case from most of Godfrey's Great Lakes material is the outcome. Most documented dogman encounters end with the human witness frightened, sometimes injured, rarely killed. This is one of a small number of cases where the response escalated to lethal force, and the triggering event, the taking of a pup from a den, is exactly the kind of provocation that would push almost any territorial predator in the natural world past the threshold of restraint. A sow black bear will kill to protect cubs. A mother wolf will do the same. What makes this different is the precision. This was not an indiscriminate mauling. It was a hunt, sustained across nearly a mile of brutal terrain that distinguished between three individuals and delivered three different outcomes matched, as far as Roy could determine, to three different levels of direct involvement in taking the pup. Milt never fully recovered. Roy stayed in occasional contact with him over the following years, partly out of professional obligation to close out the case file in his own mind, partly because he was one of very few people Milt could talk to who had seen the physical evidence and did not dismiss his account outright. Milt left Stone County within a year. He does not hunt. He does not fish. He works an indoor job in Little Rock now and has told Roy more than once that he does not go north of Interstate 40 if he can help it. The scars on his back, the ones the emergency room doctor documented as defensive and superficial, are visible in summer, and Milt has told Roy that when people ask about them, he says he was in a car accident. He has never told anyone but Roy and, eventually, a counselor he saw briefly and stopped seeing when the counselor's questions moved toward diagnoses that had nothing to do with what actually happened to him. What stays with Roy, more than the deaths themselves, is the deliberateness. He spent 30 years working wildlife law enforcement on the assumption that animals, however dangerous, operate on instinct and territory and hunger, not on judgment. This case broke that assumption in a way he has never been able to fully set back down. He told us that the hardest part of his job in the years since has not been the physical danger of the work. It has been driving past that turnoff to the Blanchard Springs Spur Road on routine patrol, knowing what is somewhere up that hollow, knowing that the Game and Fish Commission has no protocol, no classification, no procedure for what he actually encountered, and knowing that if he ever wrote the full truth into an official report, his career would end within a month and the case would still never be reopened. The system he spent his career serving simply has no place to put what he knows, so he carries it the way Milt carries his scars, visible if you know to look, explained away as something else to everyone who does not already understand. Roy does not believe the dogman population in the Sylamore district is aggressive by nature. He believes, based on 30 years of watching how wildlife responds to human pressure in that forest, that what happened to Grady, Chester, and Milt was not predation. It was defense, taken to its absolute and final conclusion against three men who walked into a den, took an infant, and treated a mother's territory like a supply chain. He believes, and he said this to us carefully, choosing his words the way a man chooses words he expects to be quoted, that if you leave that animal and whatever family group it belongs to alone, it will leave you alone. He believes the Blanchard Springs watershed is still occupied. He has not gone looking to confirm it. He does not intend to. Some questions, he told us, are better left where they are, up a hollow that most people will never hike into, behind a curtain of cedar and limestone that has kept its own secrets since long before anyone drew a county line through that part of Arkansas, and that, more than any report he was never able to file, is the only conclusion he has ever fully made peace with. Before Roy ever set foot in that hollow above Blanchard Springs, before Grady ever mounted a camera on that cedar tree, Roy had already spent the better part of 30 years learning what the Sylamore district sounds like when nothing is wrong. That distinction matters more than people who have never worked wildlife law enforcement tend to understand. A district like that has a baseline. Wood thrush and pileated woodpecker in the mornings along the creek bottoms, barred owls calling back and forth across the hollows after dark, that 8-note pattern people describe as "who cooks for you," whitetail moving through the cane at dusk with that particular crash and pause rhythm that tells you exactly what you're hearing without needing to see it. Roy had walked that district in every season, in flood and in drought, during the fall gun season when the whole forest seemed to hold its breath, and during the dead of February when the only sound for miles was wind moving through bare hickory. He knew what belonged. He came up through the department the way most Arkansas conservation officers did in his generation. 2 years at a community college before he transferred into a wildlife management program, a stint working seasonal for the Forest Service doing trail maintenance and fire watch on the Sylamore district itself before he ever carried a badge, and then the academy, and then 11 years working a rotating district assignment before he finally got the posting he wanted, the one that put him back in the hollows he had grown up hunting with his father outside Mountain View. He was not, by his own description, an imaginative man. He did not believe in ghosts. He thought Bigfoot documentaries were entertainment for people who had never actually spent a night alone in real wilderness. He had, over 3 decades, developed the kind of dry procedural skepticism that comes from spending a career explaining to distraught landowners that the thing that killed their livestock was almost certainly a coyote, not whatever their imagination had built out of a bad night and a missing goat. That skepticism is worth stating plainly, because it is the frame through which everything that follows has to be understood. Roy was not a man predisposed to see what was not there. He was, if anything, predisposed in the opposite direction, trained across a career to find the mundane explanation first and exhaust it thoroughly before considering anything else. When he tells you what he found in that hollow, he is not telling you as someone who wanted to find it. The Sylamore Ranger District sits in the eastern Ozarks, a landscape carved by water working through limestone and dolomite for tens of millions of years, producing a topography of steep, narrow hollows separated by long, flat-topped ridges, the whole system draining eventually into the White River. Blanchard Springs Caverns, one of the show caves managed by the Forest Service and open to the public on guided tours, sits within the same karst system that riddles the district with sinkholes, losing streams, and undocumented cave openings, some mapped, many not. The cave system beneath that part of Stone County has never been fully surveyed. Spelunkers and Forest Service karst specialists have documented dozens of entrances across the district, and cavers who work the area professionally will tell you, if you ask them honestly, that nobody believes the known entrances represent anywhere close to the full extent of what exists underground. That detail matters, because it gives a territorial animal something no forest canopy alone can provide: vertical escape. A creature that can move between surface terrain and an unmapped subterranean network has resources for avoiding detection that no purely surface-dwelling predator in North America possesses. Roy has thought about this more than he likes to admit. He does not believe the animal denned exclusively in that bluff shelter. He believes the shelter was a satellite location, a nursery site used for a limited window, while the pup was too young to be moved through the cave system itself, which would explain both why it was vulnerable to discovery in the first place and why, once the mother relocated her offspring after the abduction, no search Roy or anyone else conducted ever turned up a second den site anywhere in the surrounding several square miles. Grady's history in that district went back further than the 2 citations Roy had personally issued him. Roy pulled Grady's full file after the deaths, a professional habit as much as anything, and found a pattern going back over a decade. Complaints from other landowners about game cameras appearing on property lines without permission, a Forest Service law enforcement note from 6 years earlier, describing an anonymous tip about possible ginseng poaching in the Blanchard Springs watershed that named Grady specifically, but was never substantiated enough to prosecute. Grady was, in Roy's assessment, a man who had spent years testing the edges of what the forest would let him get away with, and who had built a private economy out of extracting things from public land that were not his to take. The Missouri buyer Grady had been in contact with, a man Roy's department eventually identified through phone records recovered during the investigation, had a documented history with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service investigators related to illegal trade in protected reptile and raptor species, though no charges had ever been successfully brought. That buyer, when contacted by investigators after the deaths, denied any knowledge of a cryptid specimen and denied ever speaking to Grady about anything beyond, in his words, general outdoor recreation. The phone record said otherwise, showing 11 calls between the two men in the 3 weeks leading up to the abduction, but with Grady dead and no surviving communication describing the specifics of what was being arranged, the case against the buyer never went anywhere. He has never been publicly named in connection with this incident, and he continues to operate, as far as Roy knows, out of a rural property in southern Missouri. The game camera itself is worth returning to, because what it recorded over those 11 days is the closest thing to hard evidence that exists in this entire case, and because Roy has seen the card contents directly, which very few people ever have. The camera was a standard trail camera, motion and infrared triggered, mounted at roughly 8 feet on the cedar tree. Grady selected specifically because it offered a clean sight line into the shelter mouth, without being obviously positioned at eye level. Over 11 days, the camera captured what Roy estimated at around 40 triggered events. The overwhelming majority were exactly what you would expect from any limestone bluff shelter in that part of the Ozarks. Raccoon, gray fox, a bobcat that appeared to be investigating the shelter itself on 2 separate nights, without entering, which Roy found notable in retrospect, since bobcat behavior around an active predator den of any kind typically involves rapid avoidance rather than lingering curiosity, suggesting the bobcat may have been reading signals from the shelter's occupant that a human reviewing the same footage would have no way to detect. 4 of the 40 events showed the adult, always at night, always entering or leaving on a bipedal gait, the infrared resolving a shape that Roy, watching the footage with 3 decades of wildlife identification experience behind him, could not reconcile with any species in the Arkansas Field Guide. Tall, estimated by Roy against the known height of the shelter entrance, which he measured himself during his return visit at 6 feet 2 inches at its lowest point, at somewhere between 7 and 7.5 feet, when the animal was fully upright, though it entered and left the low shelter mouth stooped, which told Roy something about its awareness of its own dimensions relative to the terrain it was navigating, a kind of spatial calculation that instinct alone does not typically produce. Dark coloration, uniform across the body in the infrared, a head profile that extended forward from the skull in a way no primate or bear produces, and that matched, when Roy later reviewed materials Linda Godfrey had published over her decades of Great Lakes research. The canine profile described consistently across hundreds of independent witness accounts he had never previously had reason to read. 3 of the 40 events showed something smaller near the shelter mouth, while the adult was recorded elsewhere, or not visible at all, consistent with the pup being left alone during what Roy came to believe was a regular nocturnal hunting or patrol circuit. The pup's movement in these clips was tentative, close to the entrance, never venturing more than a few feet into open ground, behavior entirely consistent with a young animal instinctively staying near the safety of a den while a parent is away. The camera also recorded something Roy did not fully appreciate until his return visit 3 weeks after the deaths, when he sat with the footage a second time in his own truck, with the engine off and no one else present. On the 9th night of the 11-day monitoring period, 2 nights before Grady's crew executed the abduction, the adult paused at the shelter mouth on its way out for what Roy timed at 11 seconds, turned its head directly toward the camera's mounting position on the cedar tree, and held that orientation before continuing on its circuit. It is impossible to know with certainty what that pause represented, but Roy has spent a long time turning it over, and his professional opinion, offered reluctantly and only after we pressed him on it, is that the animal had identified the camera as an anomaly days before Grady ever climbed that talus slope and had made a choice not to react to it, either because it did not perceive the device as an immediate threat to the pup, or because it wanted whoever was watching that footage to know it had been seen watching back. Whether that reads as coincidence or as something closer to a warning issued days in advance and ignored is a question Roy has never been able to set down. The chase that killed Chester deserves closer reconstruction than the initial account gave it, because the terrain itself is part of the evidence, and because understanding the terrain is the only way to understand why what happened to him is difficult to explain through any conventional predator behavior. The drainage where Chester's body was eventually recovered runs roughly northeast from the Fire Road spur where the truck was found, dropping through a series of limestone benches toward the creek below. Search and rescue volunteers who worked the recovery, speaking to Roy informally in the weeks afterward, described the terrain in that particular drainage as some of the worst technical ground in the entire district. Loose talus stacked at angles close to the point of failure. Cedar and greenbrier thickets dense enough that a search team member described needing to belly crawl through sections rather than walk. A vertical drop of nearly 200 feet compressed into less than half a mile of horizontal distance, meaning the grade averaged something close to what a hiking guide would classify as a scramble, requiring hands as much as feet, not a run. Chester covered that ground by the evidence of where his body was found relative to the truck. In the dark, at night, in unfamiliar terrain he had never scouted, wearing work boots rather than hiking boots, while being pursued. The medical examiner's report noted lacerations on his forearms and shins, consistent with impact against brush and rock during rapid, uncontrolled movement, the kind of injuries you would expect from someone moving through that terrain far faster than caution would allow, which told Roy that whatever was behind Chester was close enough, consistently enough, that stopping to pick a safer line was not a choice available to him. A black bear, the only large predator native to the district capable of producing comparable trauma, is not built for sustained pursuit across broken vertical terrain. Bears are explosively fast over short distances, capable of surprising bursts of speed that catch people who assume otherwise, but they do not have the cardiovascular architecture for a sustained mile-long pursuit uphill and down through talus and greenbrier. Whatever pursued, Chester did not lose him in that terrain, did not lose the scent trail, and did not appear to tire before he did. The distance and the duration both point toward an animal built along entirely different lines, something with the endurance profile of a wolf or a human distance runner rather than the explosive, short-burst profile of an ursine predator. Roy has read enough of Godfrey's case material at this point, and enough of what other credible witnesses have described across the country, to recognize the described gait pattern as consistent with reports from other regions. A bipedal stride when the terrain and the need for balance favor it, transitioning to a faster, ground-covering quadrupedal gait when open terrain and speed matter more than upright stability. The transition itself, described independently by witnesses in Michigan, Wisconsin, Oregon, and now Arkansas, who have never had contact with one another and in most cases have never heard of each other's accounts, is one of the details Roy finds hardest to dismiss as coincidence or fabrication. Nobody making up a story from scratch, working independently, in different decades, in different states, tends to converge on the same specific and biomechanically plausible detail, unless they are describing something that actually moves that way. The medical examiner's report on Chester, which Roy was permitted to review as the original responding officer even after the case moved into the sheriff's jurisdiction, documented the cause of death as exsanguination following a traumatic wound to the throat and upper chest, with additional perimortem injuries to both forearms, consistent with defensive posturing. The report's language on the throat wound is the part Roy will discuss only reluctantly, and only in the most clinical terms, because he understands what it implies. The wound pattern showed a single decisive bite, not a series of tearing or worrying motions consistent with a predator feeding or subduing prey through repeated attack, but one application of force sufficient to end the pursuit immediately. The medical examiner's notes describe the dental arch spacing implied by the wound as inconsistent with any canid species on record for the state, wider than a large domestic dog, wider than the largest documented coyote or wolf-dog hybrid, and estimated a bite force well in excess of what any North American canid is capable of generating. That estimate, buried in a sealed case file that will likely never see public release, is as close to forensic confirmation as this story is ever going to get, and Roy has carried the knowledge of that specific paragraph for years without being able to do anything with it. Grady's death, by contrast, happened close to the truck, within the first few hundred yards, suggesting the confrontation began almost immediately, once whatever was tracking the three men closed the distance. Roy's working theory, offered carefully and without certainty, is that Grady, as the man who organized the abduction, who made the call to take the pup, and who personally handled the crate more than either of the other two, was located and confronted first and specifically, while Chester and Milt had enough of a head start during the initial confrontation to attempt to flee. Chester's flight covered nearly a mile before it ended. Milt's flight, or perhaps his decision not to run at all beyond scrambling back toward the truck, ended with him alive. That distinction, the different outcome for each of the three men scaled against what Roy came to understand about each man's specific role in what happened to the pup, is the detail that moved Roy from a purely biological explanation toward something closer to what the Osage traditions and the Godfrey case files both describe as a being operating with judgment rather than pure instinct. An animal driven by territorial instinct and maternal aggression alone would be expected to attack the nearest available human target, or the first human target encountered, without meaningful discrimination between them. What the physical evidence suggests instead is a response that tracked specific culpability, a level of discrimination that instinct-driven aggression in any known North American predator does not produce. The audio component of this case is thinner than the video evidence recovered from Kurt's logging site in Oregon or Russ's trail cameras in Michigan, but it exists, and Roy has heard it. On the night the pup was taken from the barn, a neighboring property roughly a half-mile down the county road from Grady's parcel had a home security system with an exterior microphone, installed originally for deterring the kind of rural package, theft and equipment scrapping that has become increasingly common across rural Arkansas. That system recorded, in the small hours of the same night, 23 minutes of audio containing what the homeowner initially assumed was a pack of coyotes, before deciding the sound did not match anything she had heard in 11 years of living on that road. She provided the recording to Roy voluntarily during his initial canvass of the area, before she understood what it might be connected to, and Roy has kept a personal copy. The recording contains a series of low, sustained vocalizations, 3 to 4 seconds in duration, spaced at irregular intervals across the 23-minute window, overlapping at points in a way that suggests more than one source. The tonal quality is difficult to describe without hearing it, but Roy's best attempt, offered the same way Kurt described the sounds from the Oregon logging site, was that it reminded him less of any animal call cataloged in his wildlife identification training, and more of a conversation, exchanges passing back and forth between what he believes were at least 2 distinct vocal sources, rising and falling with what sounded like intention rather than random distress calling. An audio engineer who reviewed a copy of the recording informally, at Roy's request, and without being told the full context of where it came from, noted that the fundamental frequency of the primary vocalization sat well below the typical range for any North American canid vocalization on record, in a register closer to large ungulate or big cat vocalization than anything associated with the dog family, while the harmonic structure layered on top of that fundamental frequency showed complexity that the engineer described as more consistent with a vocal tract capable of some degree of controlled modulation than with a simple alarm or distress call. He was careful to say this analysis was informal and that he could not identify a source species, only that whatever produced the recording was not, in his professional opinion, a coyote pack, which had been Roy's officially logged explanation for the neighbor's initial complaint call. The institutional silence around this case is worth walking through in detail, because it is not the product of any single decision by any single person. It is the accumulation of a dozen smaller decisions, each individually defensible, each made by a professional protecting a career or an agency protecting itself from a classification it has no framework to handle. Start with the Stone County Sheriff's Office. Their incident report, the primary document generated in the immediate aftermath of the deaths, classifies the case as a fatal animal attack, species undetermined, with a secondary notation recommending increased signage and public caution advisories for the Blanchard Springs and North Sylamore Creek recreation areas. That classification is not dishonest. It is accurate as far as it goes, but it is also the classification that guarantees the case will never receive sustained investigative resources, because animal attacks, however unusual, do not generate the same institutional urgency as a homicide with a known or suspected human perpetrator. There is no one to arrest. There is no one to prosecute. The case, once classified this way, effectively investigates itself out of existence because there is nothing left to pursue beyond public safety messaging that a rural sheriff's department with limited staff and a wide jurisdiction has neither the time nor the specialized expertise to develop. Move to the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission, Roy's own employer. The commission's internal wildlife incident database, the system Roy would use to log any unusual predator sign or population data in his district, has fields for black bear, mountain lion, in the rare cases where a transient individual is confirmed, coyote, bobcat, and feral hog, along with a general other category intended primarily for domestic dog attacks or occasional exotic escapee incidents involving privately owned animals. There is no field, no code, no drop-down option for an unclassified bipedal canid responsible for 2 human fatalities. When Roy attempted to file even a limited incident report reflecting what his own investigation at the scene had documented, specifically the track evidence at Grady's property and the game camera footage, his supervisor's response was not hostile. It was procedural. The supervisor told him the department's incident classification system required him to select an existing category, that black bear was the closest available match given the trauma pattern, and that anything beyond that belonged in the sheriff's jurisdiction rather than the commission's. Roy filed the report as a probable black bear attack, a classification he knew to be false, because the alternative was leaving no official record at all, and because the system genuinely offered him no other option that would allow the report to be accepted and filed. That single procedural moment, a supervisor asking Roy to select the closest available checkbox, rather than describe what he had actually found, is the entire mechanism of institutional silence in miniature. Nobody lied. Nobody covered anything up in the way people imagine when they hear the phrase, government cover-up. A form simply did not have a field for the truth. And a career professional, 30 years into a job he needed to keep in order to support his family, and eventually retire with his pension intact, filled in the closest available box and moved on, the same way Russ in Michigan filed his wolf surveys around a species his own department's database had no room for, the same way a deputy on a Great Lakes patrol writes coyote on an incident report, rather than risk a supervisor asking whether he has been drinking on shift. The U.S. Forest Service, which manages the land where the abduction itself took place, and where the bluff shelter sits, was never formally notified of the connection between the deaths and the den site, because the sheriff's office investigation focused on the location where the bodies were found, several miles from the shelter itself, and the connection between the abduction and the deaths was never established as a matter of public record. Roy is one of a small number of people who understands the full chain of events. From the game camera on the cedar tree through the barn in 56, to the drainage where Chester died, because he is the one who assembled it himself, informally, off the clock, piecing together Milt's fragmented account with the physical evidence he personally documented at each location. That reconstruction exists nowhere in any official file. It exists in Roy's memory, and in a set of personal notes he keeps at his house, rather than in any department system, because he understood early on that submitting a full reconstruction through official channels would raise more questions about his own judgment than it would ever resolve about what actually happened in that forest. The economic dimension that shapes silence around dogman cases elsewhere in this catalog is present here too, though it operates differently than it did around a commercial timber sale in Oregon or a defense depot in transition in Washington state. Blanchard Springs Caverns is one of the primary tourism draws for Stone County, drawing tens of thousands of visitors annually to guided cave tours, and the broader North Sylamore Creek watershed supports a meaningful portion of the local economy through hunting leases, canoe and kayak outfitters, and seasonal tourism tied to the scenic beauty of the district. A confirmed report of a lethal predator attack tied to a specific, locatable drainage within a few miles of the caverns would not simply generate public fear. It would generate liability exposure for the Forest Service, which manages public recreation infrastructure in the area, and economic damage to a county that depends heavily on visitors feeling safe hiking, camping, and paddling in exactly the terrain where this happened. Nobody at the county or Forest Service level made an explicit decision to suppress this information for economic reasons. The decision was never that direct. It was, instead, the same pattern repeated at every level. An event that does not fit any existing classification gets filed under the closest available category, and the closest available category happens to be one that generates no public alert, no closure notice, and no change to how the district is marketed to visitors. Roy's own silence, the silence he has maintained for years beyond what his job required of him, comes from a different place than institutional self-preservation, though career preservation is part of it. He told us, in one of the more difficult parts of our conversation, that his primary reason for staying quiet, beyond the minimum his job demanded, was not fear of ridicule and not fear of losing his position, though both of those fears are real. It was a conviction, developed slowly over the months and years following the deaths, that publicizing the location and the specifics of what happened would draw exactly the kind of attention that got Grady, Chester, and Milt killed in the first place. He has seen, over 3 decades in wildlife law enforcement, what happens to a location once word spreads that something unusual and huntable might live there. Poachers organize. Amateur cryptid hunters with rifles and no wildlife identification training start showing up on public land at night. The animal responsible for 2 deaths in this account never sought out human contact. It responded, with escalating and ultimately lethal force, to direct provocation against its offspring, and then it withdrew entirely, leaving no further sign of aggressive behavior toward the search and rescue teams, the sheriff's investigators, or Roy himself, during his repeated visits to the area in the following months. Roy has come to believe that the single greatest threat to both the animal and to any future hikers or hunters in that district would be publicity that turns Blanchard Springs into a destination for people hoping to provoke a second confrontation. The deeper history of that watershed stretches back long before Grady ever heard a rumor about something denning in a bluff shelter, and long before any Forest Service trail crew claimed a sighting in the 1970s. The Ozark Plateau was, before removal, home to Osage territory that extended across much of what is now northern Arkansas and southern Missouri, with the Quapaw holding territory to the south and east, along the Arkansas and White River valleys. The Osage were forced from this region through a series of treaties and cessions in the early 1800s, culminating in their removal to what is now Oklahoma by the 1820s, decades before the more widely known removals of the 1830s swept through the broader southeast. The Ozarks, as a result, carry a layered and often underdocumented history of indigenous displacement that predates the more famous Trail of Tears narrative by a full generation, and much of the traditional knowledge specific to this exact stretch of bluff and cave country, left with the people who were forced out of it before settler folklore ever had the chance to fully absorb or record what had been known. What survives is fragmentary, filtered through the accounts of 19th and early 20th century folklorists who worked the Ozark Hill Country collecting settler stories, ballads, and superstitions. Most notably, the work later compiled by researchers studying Ozark oral tradition through the mid-20th century. Those collections describe, among dozens of other categories of folk belief, a recurring figure that settlers in the bluff country of northern Arkansas referred to variously as a wild man, a haunt, or occasionally something closer to a hound-headed man, tied consistently to specific cave systems and bluff shelters, rather than appearing as a generalized forest boogeyman. The specificity of location in these accounts, the fact that the stories attach themselves to particular hollows and particular bluffs, rather than floating freely across the whole region, is what separates genuine folk tradition from invented campfire tales, and it is a pattern folklorists studying oral tradition generally treat as a marker of accounts rooted in some kind of real, repeated observation, rather than pure imagination. None of this can be verified against Osage sources directly, and it would be dishonest to claim otherwise. The specific traditions that the Osage and Quapaw peoples held regarding this landscape belonged to those nations, were disrupted by forced removal before full documentation by outside researchers occurred, and are not something available for a documentary narrator to reconstruct or speak for. What can be said honestly is that the pattern the settler folklore preserves, a being tied to specific karst terrain, approached with caution rather than curiosity, is consistent with the broader pattern Linda Godfrey documented across her Great Lakes research among the Ojibwe and other Great Lakes nations, where traditions describing canine-associated beings tied to specific territories predate European contact and were met, when outside researchers eventually asked about them, with careful acknowledgement rather than either enthusiastic elaboration or flat denial. That same posture, guarded confirmation without volunteered detail, is what Roy encountered decades later, informally, when he mentioned the case to a cultural resource contact, working with a tribal historic preservation office during an unrelated Forest Service consultation on a separate project in the district. The contact, according to Roy, did not deny that the area had a history connected to what Roy was describing. The contact simply said it was not something to be discussed with outside media, and the conversation moved on. The 1970s Forest Service sighting that circulated as local rumor for 2 generations before Grady ever acted on it deserves more scrutiny than the version passed at deer camp typically gives it. Roy tracked down a retired Forest Service employee, a man in his 80s by the time Roy found him, who had been a young trail crew member on the Sylamore district in the mid-1970s and who confirmed, cautiously, and only after Roy explained why he was asking, that the story had a real origin. A 3-man trail maintenance crew clearing blowdown on a fire road not far from the Blanchard Springs area had, according to the retired employee, encountered something crossing the road at dusk that none of them could identify. Upright, tall, moving with a gait none of the 3 had ever seen from any known animal. The crew reported it informally to their district ranger at the time, who logged it internally as an unusual bear sighting and told the crew not to discuss it further, out of concern, as the retired employee remembered it being explained, that reports of unidentified large animals near a developing tourist attraction like Blanchard Springs Caverns, which was still being actively promoted and expanded through that decade, would generate exactly the kind of negative publicity the Forest Service did not want attached to a site it was investing significant federal money into developing for public recreation. The instruction to stay quiet was not framed as suppression. It was framed, the retired employee told Roy, as simple professional caution, the same kind of caution any government employee exercises when asked to avoid speculation in an official capacity. But the effect across 5 decades was the same as any deliberate suppression would have produced. The story survived only as rumor, stripped of its original source and its original credibility, until Grady heard a garbled, second-hand version of it decades later, and treated it as nothing more than a treasure map. Milt's life since the deaths deserves more space than a brief summary gives it, because what happened to him after the physical wounds healed is, in its own way, as much a part of this story as what happened in that hollow. He spent 4 days in the hospital in Batesville, treated primarily for exposure, dehydration, and the superficial lacerations across his back and shoulders, though the attending physician also noted, in records Roy was later able to review with Milt's own permission, signs consistent with acute stress reaction severe enough that a psychiatric consult was recommended before discharge. Milt declined the consult at the time. He told the hospital staff he simply wanted to go home. Home did not last long. Roy stayed in touch with the family in the immediate aftermath, partly out of the ordinary follow-up work any responding officer does on a case involving a fatality, partly because he sensed, correctly, that Milt was the only living source who could help him understand what had actually happened before the search team arrived. Milt's mother told Roy, in a conversation several weeks after the funerals, that her son had stopped sleeping in his own bedroom, moving instead to the living room couch, where he could keep the television on through the night, unable to tolerate the silence and darkness of a bedroom with a window facing the tree line behind the house. He flinched, she said, at sounds that would not have registered with him before. A screen door closing 2 houses down. A dog barking somewhere across the hollow. He asked his mother, more than once, to check that the doors were locked, something he had never done before in his life, growing up in a house where the doors were rarely locked at all. Milt eventually agreed to see a counselor, a licensed clinician in Batesville who specialized in trauma related to violent loss, and he continued seeing her for close to a year. Roy does not know the specifics of what was discussed in those sessions, and would not share them if he did, but he knows the relationship ended when Milt, in his own words to Roy sometime later, felt the counselor's questions were steering toward an explanation he could not accept, treating his account of what he had seen in the shelter and what he believed had happened to Grady and Chester as a symptom to be managed, rather than a description of events to be believed. Milt was not diagnosed, as far as Roy is aware, with any specific psychiatric condition tied to his account of the creature itself. The clinical language in what limited documentation Roy has seen refers only to acute and then prolonged stress responses following witnessed violent death, language that would apply equally whether the underlying cause was an unclassified predator or a car accident. But Milt, rightly or not, felt unheard in a way that made continued treatment feel counterproductive, and he stopped going. He left Stone County within the year, first to stay with an aunt in Jonesboro, and eventually settling in Little Rock, where he found work in a warehouse distribution center, a job that Roy notes, with something like quiet understanding, keeps him indoors under fluorescent light for most of his working hours, about as far removed from a limestone bluff shelter in the Ozarks as a job in central Arkansas can be. Milt does not hunt. He never hunted seriously before the incident either, by his own account, having gone along with Grady and Chester more out of family obligation and the promise of an easy payday than any real interest in the outdoors, which Roy has come to see as one of the small mercies in an otherwise brutal story. Milt was the least invested of the 3 men in what they were doing that night, the one who, by Roy's own reconstruction, likely had the least direct culpability in the actual handling of the pup, and he is also the one who survived. Roy has asked Milt, over the several conversations they have had across the years since, whether he remembers anything from the confrontation itself, beyond the scratches on his back and the blank period of missing time between running from the truck and being found sitting in it 2 days later. Milt has told him, consistently, that he does not, or will not. Roy has chosen not to press it. He has enough experience with trauma-related memory gaps from other cases in his career, car accidents, and violent assaults, where witnesses simply cannot access certain windows of time no matter how much they want to recognize that pushing Milt to recover those memories would serve Roy's curiosity far more than it would serve Milt's well-being. And Roy has decided, more than once, that he is not willing to make that trade. Roy's own life changed in quieter, less visible ways. He did not leave his job. He did not leave the district, which surprised some of his colleagues, given that most people who go through something like this, discovering 2 mutilated bodies, and piecing together the true cause over months of informal investigation, might reasonably want to transfer to somewhere far removed from the site. Roy stayed, in part because he did not know how to explain a transfer request without explaining the reason behind it, and in part because he had come to feel, over the years since, a kind of obligation to the district that he struggles to fully articulate. He patrols the Blanchard Springs area regularly, as part of his normal duties, and he has never again found sign of the kind he documented in the weeks after the deaths. No claw marks in stone, no tracks, no vocalizations picked up on any resident's security system. Whether that reflects the animal relocating its territory after the trauma of losing and recovering its offspring, or simply reflects an animal returning to the same baseline pattern of careful invisibility it maintained for the 2 generations before Grady ever heard a rumor about it, Roy does not know, and he has stopped trying to guess. There is a version of this story that would be easier to tell, one where the animal is simply a monster, and the 3 men are simply victims of an indiscriminate predator that happened to cross their path. That version is not what the evidence supports, and Roy, for all his professional caution about overstating what he can prove, has never pretended otherwise when we pressed him directly. The evidence supports a mother reclaiming her offspring through force that escalated only after the offspring had already been taken, transported, caged, and held overnight in conditions that any biologist would recognize as extreme stress for a young animal of any species. The evidence supports discrimination in the response. A chase that pursued the man who ran furthest and hardest. A decisive and immediate confrontation for the man who organized the abduction. And restraint, marked but real restraint, toward the man whose involvement was most peripheral. None of that reads as random predation. It reads as judgment, applied by something that had every biological right, under any framework of animal behavior science that already exists for maternal defense in mammals, to respond exactly the way it did. That does not make the deaths anything other than a tragedy. Grady and Chester were real men with real families, who buried them in real graves in a real cemetery outside 56, and the fact that their deaths followed directly from a decision they made to take an infant animal from its den does not erase the grief their families carry, or absolve anyone of examining what drove 3 men in rural Arkansas to believe that trafficking a cryptid pup to a buyer in Missouri was a reasonable way to make money. The economic desperation that runs through so much of the wildlife trafficking that Roy spent his career investigating, ginseng poaching, bear gallbladder trafficking, illegal timber theft, is not separate from what happened here. It is the same pressure, applied to a target that turned out to be capable of a response no deer poacher or ginseng digger has ever had to reckon with. Roy has spent a long time sitting with the discomfort of holding both of those truths at once, that the men who died made a choice that led directly and predictably, in retrospect, to their deaths, and that they were still men, imperfect and financially strained, and reaching for an opportunity that seemed too good to pass up, not villains in the way easy narratives want to make them. The larger ethical question, the one that extends beyond this single case, is what happens if the broader existence of this population becomes public in any verified, undeniable way. Roy has thought about this more than most people would expect from a man whose entire professional training pushes him toward documentation and disclosure. If the Sylamore District's dogman population became confirmed fact rather than rural rumor, the response would not be measured or careful. It would look like every other moment in American history when a rare or unusual animal population became a media sensation in an accessible, huntable landscape. Trophy hunters would come first, some legitimately hoping to be the person who bags the first confirmed specimen, others simply drawn by the novelty and the promise of notoriety. Amateur cryptid researchers, well-intentioned but poorly equipped, would flood the district with trail cameras and night vision equipment, and no meaningful training in how to avoid provoking a territorial animal that has already demonstrated, in this exact drainage, what it is capable of when provoked. The Forest Service would face pressure to close public access to a section of a national forest that generates real recreational and economic value for the surrounding counties, a decision that would draw political opposition regardless of the underlying justification. And the animal itself, and whatever family group it is part of, would face a level of human pressure and potential violence that centuries of careful invisibility have so far protected it from. Roy does not have a clean answer to whether silence is the right choice. He has settled, uneasily, on believing that it is the least bad option available given what he has personally seen the alternative produce elsewhere, based on stories he has heard secondhand through informal networks of wildlife officers across other states who have dealt with their own versions of publicized cryptid activity, turning into circuses of armed amateurs converging on public packless land. But he does not pretend that decision is morally uncomplicated. Somewhere in that calculation is the honest acknowledgement that maintaining silence also means that if another Grady decides, on his own initiative, to try the same thing again in a different drainage, there is no public warning system in place to stop him. No official record anyone outside a small circle even knows exists. Roy carries that weight the way he carries everything else about this case, without any illusion that he has solved it, only that he has made the choice he can live with. If you have spent any real time in that stretch of the Ozarks, hiking the trails around Blanchard Springs, floating the North Sylamore on a summer weekend, or hunting the ridges above 56 during gun season, you already know the particular quality of quiet those hollows can hold. The way sound behaves differently once you drop off a ridge into one of those steep limestone drainages. How a call from a barred owl or a distant dog can seem to come from every direction and no direction at once. Let us know in the comments if you have ever had an experience out there you could not fully explain. Because in the years since this case, Roy has quietly heard from a small number of other people connected to that district, hunters and hikers, and at least one canoe outfitter working the North Sylamore, who described encounters they never reported to anyone official, out of the same fear of ridicule that kept Roy's own report locked in a personal notebook rather than an official file. What Roy has come to understand, piecing together those informal accounts against his own documented evidence, is that the animal or animals responsible for what happened to Grady and Chester likely represent a small, established population that has occupied the karst systems of the Sylamore district for a very long time, possibly generations, using the extensive and still largely unmapped cave network beneath that part of Stone County as a resource no purely surface-dwelling predator anywhere else in the Ozarks fully has access to. That access to subterranean terrain may explain something that has puzzled Roy since he first started connecting the dots: how a large-bodied animal capable of the physical output demonstrated in the pursuit that killed Chester could have gone undetected, or underdetected, across an entire region, for as long as it apparently has. A population that spends significant time below ground, moving between surface hunting grounds, and a network of passages that human cavers themselves have not fully mapped after decades of exploration, has resources for avoiding detection that no forest canopy alone provides. It is the same insight that shapes how researchers think about mountain lion populations in regions where verified sightings remain rare despite suitable habitat. An animal built for avoidance simply requires far less territory to remain functionally invisible than most people assume. And a population with access to a vertical escape route that human search technology cannot easily follow has an advantage that surface-bound animals in more open terrain, like the high desert dogman population documented at the former chemical depot in eastern Oregon, simply do not share. The behavioral consistency across these documented cases, despite the enormous differences in terrain, climate, and regional history, is what makes dismissing any single account increasingly difficult once you have looked closely at several of them side by side. A retired wildlife technician in the cedar and hardwood forests of northern Michigan documents 11 years of territorial marking, camera destruction, and mutual surveillance along a river corridor. A security contractor patrolling an abandoned chemical weapons depot in the high desert of eastern Oregon documents coordinated group movement, camera manipulation, and a structured vocalization pattern that produces the same physiological response in listeners 1,800 miles and 5 years removed from an almost identical account given by a conservation officer in a different Wisconsin forest. A logging crew in the wet, dense timber of the southern Oregon Coast Range documents targeted, escalating sabotage of heavy equipment by creatures displaying an understanding of mechanical systems that goes well beyond animal curiosity. And here, in the dry limestone hollows of the Arkansas Ozarks, a mother recovers her stolen offspring and then delivers a response scaled with what can only be described as judgment against the specific men responsible. None of these witnesses knew each other. None of them had access to each other's accounts before giving their own, and yet the creature they each describe, upright, canine-headed, roughly 7 to 8 feet at full height, dark-furred, capable of transitioning fluidly between bipedal and quadrupedal movement, displaying awareness of human technology and behavior that exceeds anything documented in known North American predators, is functionally the same animal, adapted to 4 wildly different ecosystems the way any successful, wide-ranging species adapts to the specific resources and hazards of the terrain it occupies. Linda Godfrey spent 3 decades collecting exactly this kind of cross-regional consistency from witnesses who had every reason to describe something different if they were simply inventing an experience, and instead kept converging, independently, on the same fundamental profile. Roy returned to the Bluff shelter a second time, roughly a year after the deaths, this time not alone, but accompanied by a wildlife biologist he had come to trust over the years, a man affiliated with a small university research program in northern Arkansas who had helped Roy on unrelated black bear population studies in the past, and who Roy decided, after a great deal of deliberation, he could bring into a limited version of the truth. Roy did not tell the biologist the full story, He told him he had documented unusual sign in the district, possibly a large transient predator, and asked whether he would be willing to look at photographs and offer an off-the-record opinion. The biologist agreed, on the understanding that nothing discussed would be attributed to him publicly, a condition Roy has honored completely. The biologist reviewed the photographs Roy had taken of the claw marks in the limestone at the back of the shelter, the track castings Roy had made from the prints found in the pasture behind Grady's barn, and stills pulled from the game camera footage. His response, according to Roy, was measured and professional in a way that Roy found both reassuring and unsettling in equal measure. He did not laugh. He did not dismiss the material outright. He said the claw spacing and depth in the limestone photographs did not match any documented Arkansas species, and that cutting into stone rather than bark at all was itself outside the behavioral repertoire of every large mammal native to the region. He said the track dimensions and stride length, if accurately measured, described an animal well beyond the size range of anything currently confirmed to exist in the state, though he was careful to note that measurement error in field conditions is common enough that he would want to see the physical casts himself before drawing any firm conclusion. On the game camera stills, he was more guarded. He said the image quality and the low light conditions made definitive identification difficult, that the shapes were consistent with a bear standing upright in some frames, though he acknowledged, when Roy pushed him on the specific proportions, that the height-to-shoulder ratio visible in the clearest frame did not match typical black bear anatomy particularly well. What the biologist would not do, and told Roy plainly he would not do, was put his name to any report suggesting an unclassified species was responsible, regardless of what the physical evidence suggested to him personally. He explained, in terms Roy found honest rather than evasive, that doing so would end his ability to secure research funding, damage his standing with the state agencies he depended on for access and collaboration on his actual funded projects, and very likely result in his findings being dismissed by the broader scientific community, regardless of the quality of the underlying evidence, simply because the conclusion itself falls so far outside the boundaries of what mainstream wildlife biology is willing to engage with as a serious hypothesis. He told Roy, in what Roy has described as one of the most honest professional conversations of his career, that the evidence troubled him more than he was comfortable admitting, and that he intended to think about it further, but that thinking about it privately and staking his career on it publicly were two entirely different propositions, and he was only willing to do the former. That conversation crystallized something for Roy that he had been circling for months without fully articulating: the gap between what credible, trained professionals privately believe when shown the evidence, and what those same professionals are willing to state publicly, is not a gap created by any conspiracy or any active suppression. It is a gap created by the ordinary, rational calculation every professional makes about the cost of attaching their name and their credibility to a conclusion that the institutions they depend on for their livelihood are not prepared to accept. Multiply that calculation across a game warden, a sheriff's department, a Forest Service district office, a university biologist, and an emergency room physician documenting bite pattern evidence in a sealed medical examiner's file, and you get exactly what this case has produced. Comprehensive documentation, held by multiple independent, credible sources, that adds up to something undeniable when assembled together, and that will likely never be assembled together publicly, because no single person holding a piece of it has sufficient reason to be the one who steps forward first. There is a particular moment Roy keeps returning to, more than any single piece of physical evidence, more than the claw marks in the stone or the bite pattern documented in the sealed medical examiner's file. It happened during his second visit to the shelter, the one with the biologist, near the end of the afternoon as the light was starting to fail, and the two of them were packing up equipment to hike back down the talus slope to the fire road. Roy said he stepped to the mouth of the shelter, looked out over the drop toward the creek far below, and had the distinct, unshakable sense that he was being watched from somewhere across the hollow, not with any hostility, but with what he described, hesitating over the word before he used it, as attentiveness. He did not see anything. He did not hear anything beyond the ordinary late afternoon sounds of the forest, settling toward evening. He simply stood there for perhaps 30 seconds, with the hair raised on his forearms. A physical sensation he has felt only a handful of times in 3 decades of solitary work in remote terrain, always in situations that turned out, upon investigation, to involve a large, watching predator he had not yet consciously detected. He did not mention it to the biologist. He has mentioned it to almost no one since, because he understands exactly how it sounds. A grown man with 30 years of professional wildlife experience describing a feeling rather than evidence. But he has told us, directly, that he trusts that instinct more than he trusts almost anything else in his professional toolkit, because it has been right, in his experience, far more often than it has been wrong. What that moment represents, if Roy's instinct is accurate, is not aggression and not a continuing threat. It is closer to what Godfrey's research consistently documents across the behavioral patterns of witnesses who return to a known territory after an initial encounter. An animal that monitors human presence within its range, without escalating toward confrontation unless directly provoked. The same pattern that let Kurt's logging crew in Oregon walk away from a landing after their equipment was destroyed rather than being physically harmed. The same pattern that let a security contractor in the high desert spend nearly 3 years sharing territory with a breeding population without ever being touched. The animal in the Sylamore district killed 2 men who took its offspring from a den and held it captive overnight in a barn. It has not, as far as any evidence available to Roy indicates, threatened or harmed a single person in the years since, despite Roy's own repeated and, by his own admission, sometimes careless presence in its territory during his informal follow-up investigations. That restraint, extended specifically and consistently toward a man who has walked back into that hollow more than once with cameras and measuring tape, is itself a kind of communication, if you are willing to read it that way. Roy has come to read it that way, cautiously, the same careful, provisional way he approaches every piece of evidence in a case he knows he will never be able to fully close. The economics of what nearly happened, had Grady succeeded in delivering that pup to his Missouri buyer, deserve a final word, because they connect this single, contained tragedy in rural Stone County to a much larger and uglier pattern that runs beneath the entire subject of undocumented wildlife in North America. Wildlife trafficking is, by every estimate compiled by federal enforcement agencies, one of the most lucrative illegal trades in the world, generating billions of dollars annually across ivory, rhino horn, exotic reptiles, rare birds, and increasingly, as demand among wealthy private collectors has diversified, virtually anything rare enough to command a premium from someone with more money than restraint. A verified, living cryptid specimen, something no zoo, no private collection, and no black market network anywhere in the world currently possesses, would represent a payday that dwarfs anything else in that trade. And the buyer Grady was in contact with is, by Roy's assessment and by the documented history investigators found, connecting him to prior wildlife trafficking activity. Exactly the kind of person positioned to attempt exactly this kind of acquisition again, with a different target, in a different state, whenever the next rumor reaches him through the same informal network that connected him to Grady in the first place. Roy does not know whether that buyer, or people like him, are still actively pursuing leads on dogman populations elsewhere in the country. He has no way to know, but he has thought, more than once, about what it would mean if the next attempt succeeded where Grady's did not. If a pup were successfully removed from a territory and transported far enough, fast enough, that a grieving parent's pursuit and its eventual, terrible reckoning never had the chance to catch up. That thought is part of why Roy has never fully closed the door on someday finding a way to make some version of this story public, carefully, without revealing the exact location, in the hope that it might make the next Grady think twice, or make the next buyer understand what he is actually asking someone to risk. There is one more piece of physical evidence that Roy held back from us until our final conversation, something he had not mentioned in any of our earlier calls, and that he told us, when he finally described it, he had never spoken about to anyone outside his own household. It concerns the pole barn on Grady's property, the one where the pup was held overnight before it was reclaimed. The property sat vacant for nearly 2 years, after the deaths, tied up in the kind of probate and family dispute that follows any sudden death without a clear estate plan, before it was eventually sold to a new owner from outside the county, who had no knowledge of what had happened there beyond the general, garbled version of the story that circulates locally as a cautionary tale about a bad animal attack. Roy drove past the property periodically during those 2 vacant years, partly out of professional habit, partly, he admits, out of something closer to compulsion. On one of those drives, roughly 18 months after the deaths, in early spring, Roy noticed the pole barn doors standing open, which struck him as unusual for a vacant property that should have been secured by whoever was managing the estate. He stopped, more out of routine wildlife officer caution about an open structure that might be sheltering livestock or wildlife than any specific expectation, and walked the barn's interior alone. The stall where the pup had been held was exactly as it had been left, the bent and torn mesh panel still hanging from one corner of the partition where it had been peeled back nearly 2 years earlier, nobody having bothered to repair or remove it during the brief, chaotic period when Grady's estate was being handled. What Roy found new, what had not been there during his original investigation, was a scattering of what he identified, after some hesitation, as scent marking, a musky, heavy odor concentrated specifically around the base of that same stall partition, fresh enough that Roy estimated it had been deposited within the past few days rather than lingering for months. He does not know why an animal that had, by every indication, relocated away from active use of the original bluff shelter and largely withdrawn from documented activity anywhere near human structures in the years since the deaths, would return specifically to that one stall, on a vacant property, marking a location that held no food value, no shelter value, and no strategic importance beyond the fact that it was the exact place where its offspring had been held captive nearly 2 years earlier. Roy has turned this over more than almost any other detail in the case. His best, most tentative interpretation, offered only after we pressed him to give one, is that the marking was not territorial in the conventional sense at all, not a boundary claim in the way the claw marks in the limestone at the shelter clearly were. It read to him, though he was careful to frame this as impression rather than conclusion, as something closer to memory. A place revisited not because it mattered to present survival, but because it mattered, in whatever way an animal capable of the judgment Roy had already witnessed processes such things, to something that had happened there. Roy left the barn that day and did not go back. He has driven past the property since, after the new owners moved in, and has seen nothing to suggest continued activity, no further sign, no further reason for concern. He has chosen to treat that single visit as a closed chapter rather than an ongoing pattern, though he acknowledges he cannot be certain that judgment is correct, only that it is the judgment he has to make in order to continue doing his job in that district without being consumed by a case that officially does not exist, and that he alone, among the handful of people who know its full shape, has any responsibility for managing. Roy is close enough to retirement now that he has started thinking, in a way he did not allow himself to for years, about what happens to this case once he is no longer the officer patrolling that district. He has no formal successor briefed on any of it, because there is nothing formal to brief anyone on, only a private notebook, a handful of photographs, a set of track castings sitting in a box in his garage, and a memory he has never been able to set down completely. He has thought about handing some version of it to his eventual replacement, informally, the way an outgoing officer sometimes passes along the unofficial knowledge that never makes it into any training manual. The poacher who always works the same ridge during the second week of gun season, the landowner who will call in a false complaint out of spite, the stretch of river that floods faster than the gauges suggest. Whether a dead mother's response to the loss and recovery of her offspring belongs in that same category of informal, inherited local knowledge is something Roy has not decided. He suspects he will make that decision only when the day actually arrives, the way most decisions like this end up getting made, not through careful advance planning but through the pressure of the moment finally forcing a choice that has been avoided for years. What Roy wants people to understand, if this story ever reaches an audience beyond the small circle who already know it, is not that the Ozarks are dangerous in some new or heightened way. He has spent 30 years telling people the woods are safer than they think, that the real risks in that forest are the ordinary ones. A broken ankle 6 miles from the trailhead, a flash flood in a slot canyon during a storm nobody saw coming, hypothermia from an unexpected cold snap in October. He still believes that. What happened to Grady and Chester was not random. It was not the forest turning dangerous. It was two specific men making a specific choice to take something that did not belong to them from a place they had no right to disturb, and receiving a response that, however extraordinary its source, followed a logic as old as motherhood itself. Roy does not want anyone hearing this story to come away afraid of the North Sylamore Creek watershed. He wants them to come away understanding that some things in that forest are still owed the same basic respect you would extend to any wild animal defending its young, and that the consequences of forgetting that respect, in this one specific and terrible case, turned out to be more severe than anyone involved could have imagined until it was far too late to matter. It is worth stepping back at this point to consider the physical scale of what Roy's evidence collectively describes, because the individual details, a track here, a claw mark there, a bite pattern in a sealed report, can lose their weight when they are not held together against each other. An animal capable of stride lengths approaching 5 feet at a walk, an animal capable of bending welded half-inch steel rod, with what the evidence suggests was direct manual force rather than repeated battering, an animal capable of sustaining a pursuit across nearly a mile of the steepest, most broken terrain in the district without losing pace, over ground that exhausted search and rescue professionals working in daylight with proper equipment, an animal with a bite force sufficient to end a grown man's flight in a single application, with a dental arch too wide for any documented North American canid, an animal capable of vocalizations complex enough that an audio engineer, reviewing the recording with no prior context, described the harmonic structure as suggesting some degree of controlled modulation. Any one of these details, taken alone, might be explained away as measurement error, exaggeration under stress, or misidentification. Taken together, cross-referenced against physical evidence collected by a 30-year professional, with every incentive to find the mundane explanation first, they describe something that does not fit inside the boundaries of what current wildlife science is prepared to acknowledge exists in the state of Arkansas, or arguably anywhere in North America. The uncomfortable truth sitting underneath all of it is that this is not a story about a monster hiding in the woods waiting to hurt people. It is a story about an animal that, by every available measure, wanted nothing to do with human beings at all, that had gone to extraordinary and evidently successful lengths across at least 2 generations to avoid exactly the kind of exposure that ended up costing 2 men their lives, and that was pulled directly and violently into confrontation only because 3 men decided its offspring was worth more to them as a commodity than that animal's own life had any right to be respected as a living thing defending its family. The tragedy here runs in both directions. Grady, Chester, and Milt paid a price that Roy, even now, describes as proportionate to what they did, however difficult that is to say about men who are dead and buried and mourned by families who loved them, regardless of the choices that led to their deaths. And an animal that had successfully avoided this exact outcome for as long as anyone can trace was forced, by 3 strangers with a feed sack and a cattle prod, into the one kind of confrontation that its entire evolutionary and behavioral strategy of invisibility had presumably been built to prevent. If you want to understand why a case with this much documented physical evidence, track castings, a sealed medical examiner's report with forensic bite pattern analysis, a game camera card, a neighbor's security audio recording, and the informal but professionally grounded opinion of a university wildlife biologist has never surfaced publicly in any meaningful way. You have to stop looking for a single villain in a cover-up and start looking at the shape of the incentives every single person in this account was operating under. A sheriff's department that classified the case the only way its own system allowed and moved on to the next call. A game and fish commission whose incident database simply had no box to check for the truth. A Forest Service that discouraged a nervous trail crew from talking about an unexplained sighting near a developing tourist attraction 50 years before any of this happened, and in doing so ensured the story survived only as garbled rumor rather than documented caution. A biologist unwilling to attach his name and his funding to a conclusion his own institution would never accept. A grieving family that wanted the story to end, not multiply. A surviving witness too traumatized to want his account picked apart by strangers. And a game warden who has spent years weighing the cost of speaking against the cost of silence, and has so far chosen silence every time the choice has come up, not out of fear for himself, but out of a genuine, hard-won belief that publicity would do more harm than good to the one party in this entire story that never asked to be involved in any of it. That is the real shape of institutional silence around cases like this one. Not a conspiracy with a chain of command and a cover story. A dozen individually reasonable people, each protecting something real: career, funding, family, grief, an animal's continued survival, each making a defensible choice in isolation that adds up, collectively, to a case file that exists in fragments across a sheriff's department, a state wildlife agency, a sealed medical examiner's office, a retired game warden's garage, and nowhere else. Never assembled, never published, never resolved. There is a broader pattern in wildlife trafficking cases generally that Roy has come to see this incident as an extreme, almost archetypal example of, and it is worth spending a moment on, because it explains something about why Grady, a man who had spent over a decade successfully extracting ginseng, bear parts, and timber from public land without ever facing serious consequences, made the specific and fatal miscalculation he made with this particular target. Every other form of wildlife trafficking Grady had engaged in involved species that, however protected on paper, do not fight back in any way that scales to match a human with a rifle and a truck. A poacher taking a black bear out of season faces legal risk, not physical risk, from the animal itself. A ginseng digger stripping a hillside faces no risk at all beyond a fine if caught. Grady's entire criminal career had trained him, through over a decade of consistent reinforcement, to believe that the forest's only real danger was getting caught by someone like Roy, not the animals themselves. That assumption, built up over years of successfully extracting protected and semi-protected resources from public land without consequence, is very likely what let him walk into that bluff shelter, with a livestock crate and a cattle prod with what Milt described as genuine, unbothered confidence. The confidence of a man who had done risky things in that forest many times before, and had never once had the forest itself push back. What Grady failed to account for, and what nearly every documented dogman encounter across this entire catalog of cases ultimately comes back to, is that this specific animal operates by a completely different calculus than every other species he had trafficked. It does not simply flee from human presence the way a bear will, retreating into denser cover at the first sign of a person on the landscape. It does not rely purely on legal deterrents that only matter if you get caught by another human being. It assesses threats directly, individually, and it responds with a scaled, deliberate use of force that Grady's entire career of successfully outmaneuvering human law enforcement had never prepared him to anticipate. He had spent a decade learning how to avoid game wardens. He had spent zero time learning how to avoid the actual owner of the resource he was trying to steal. Because until that October night, as far as anyone can determine, nobody in that part of Stone County had ever needed to. Roy has spent time, more than he expected to when he first started, thinking about what kind of intelligence produces the specific behaviors documented in this case, because it does not map cleanly onto the way most people, including most trained wildlife biologists, are taught to think about animal cognition. The camera pausing to look directly at the mounting position on the 9th night, well before anyone climbed that talus slope, suggests an awareness of surveillance technology and its function that goes beyond simple habituation to a strange object in the environment. The discriminated response across 3 men with 3 different levels of direct involvement suggests something closer to an assessment of individual culpability than a generalized territorial rage. The return visit to the barn stall nearly 2 years after the fact, marking a location with no ongoing strategic value, suggests something that at minimum functions like memory tied to emotional significance, whether or not that is the correct scientific term for whatever process is actually occurring inside an animal. Biology has not yet been permitted to formally study. None of this requires supernatural explanation. Corvids solve multi-step puzzles and remember human faces for years. Elephants return to the bones of dead herd members. Octopuses recognize individual human handlers and respond differently to people who have treated them well versus people who have not. Advanced cognition, tool use, discriminated social memory, and emotionally weighted behavior are not unique to humans in the natural world, and they are not, on their own, evidence of anything beyond a highly intelligent animal operating well within the bounds of what evolutionary biology already understands to be possible in other species. What makes this case remarkable is not that an animal displayed this kind of cognition. It is that an animal displaying this kind of cognition, at this scale, in a body this large and this physically capable, has gone almost entirely undocumented by mainstream science, protected by a combination of genuinely remote terrain, an extensive and still unmapped cave system, and a species-wide strategy of avoidance so effective that it has apparently worked for as long as anyone in that district can trace back through rumor and folklore. Roy does not claim to understand what he encountered in any complete sense. He has told us, more than once, that the not knowing is the hardest part of carrying this case, harder in some ways than the trauma of finding the bodies themselves. He knows how to close a poaching case. He knows how to file a report on a bear conflict, a timber theft, a game violation. He does not know how to close this one, because there is no form for it, no protocol, no established body of scientific literature he can consult to tell him what he actually found in that limestone country. What he has instead is a lifetime of professional instinct telling him the evidence is real, a personal conviction that speaking publicly would put both the surviving human community and the animal itself at greater risk than staying quiet, and a private notebook in his garage that may, someday, be the only surviving record that any of this happened at all. There is a final layer to this case worth walking through, one that Roy only mentioned near the very end of our last conversation, almost as an afterthought, though it may be the single most consequential detail in the entire account. When Roy finally sat down, years after the fact, and mapped every piece of evidence he had collected against a topographic map of the district, the way he had learned to do from decades of building poaching cases where patterns across time and geography matter as much as any single incident, he found something he had not been looking for. Going back through old incident logs and informal complaint records from his own department, spanning nearly 15 years before Grady ever climbed that talus slope, Roy identified 6 separate, minor, previously unremarkable reports from within roughly a 10-mile radius of the Blanchard Springs watershed that, taken individually, had each been logged as something mundane. A hunter in the early 2000s reporting an unusually large canine track he assumed belonged to someone's escaped hunting dog. A landowner in the mid-2000s filing a nuisance complaint about livestock disturbed overnight by what she assumed was a large coyote. A hiker on the North Sylamore Creek Trail in the 2010s describing, in an offhand comment to a Forest Service ranger that never made it into any formal report, a strange vocalization she heard echoing off the bluffs at dusk that she could not place. None of these had ever been connected to each other. None of them had ever been connected to Roy's own case. Each one had simply been filed under whatever mundane category the reporting officer had available, exactly the way Roy's own report on Grady's death had been filed as a probable bear attack, and then forgotten, laid out together on Roy's map. Those 6 scattered, decades-old reports formed a rough cluster centered almost precisely on the same watershed where the bluff shelter sits, spanning a territory of roughly the same size and shape that Russ, the retired Michigan wildlife technician documented in an entirely different case, in an entirely different state, had mapped for his own territorial dogman population, using 11 years of dedicated field observation. Roy had not set out to build that kind of long-term behavioral case. He had built it by accident, retroactively, out of institutional records that existed for over a decade before he had any reason to look at them as anything other than routine noise. It is, in its own quiet way, some of the most convincing evidence in this entire account, not because any single report is remarkable on its own, but because the pattern was sitting there the entire time, invisible only because nobody had ever had a reason to connect the dots, until a tragedy forced one man to go looking. Roy has never gone back through those 6 old reports and attempted to interview the original complainants. He considered it, briefly, in the months after he first connected the pattern and decided against it, for reasons that track with everything else about how he has handled this case. Reopening contact with a landowner who filed a nuisance complaint about a coyote disturbing her livestock 15 years earlier, and asking her whether she would be willing to reconsider what she actually heard that night. In light of new information, Roy is not prepared to explain in any official capacity, risks exactly the kind of exposure Roy has spent years trying to avoid. It risks frightening someone who has long since moved on from a minor, forgotten incident. It risks generating exactly the kind of local rumor that eventually reached Grady in garbled, secondhand form and got 2 men killed. Roy has decided, and he has been consistent about this every time the subject comes up, that the map he built for himself is enough. It does not need to become anyone else's map, what that decision costs him. And he has been honest about this cost in ways that stand out against how guarded he is about almost everything else connected to this case. Is the isolation of being the only person who has ever seen the full pattern assembled in one place. 30 years of a career spent building cases collaboratively, working with sheriff's deputies and Forest Service law enforcement and, in the biologist case, an outside academic willing to offer at least a limited, informal opinion, and at the center of the single most significant case of his career, Roy is entirely alone. There is no partner to compare notes with. There is no supervisor to review his conclusions. There is no peer review, no second opinion beyond the biologist's carefully hedged assessment of a handful of photographs, no institutional structure of any kind supporting the work he has done piecing this together. He built the most complete account of a documented, evidence-backed dogman territory that likely exists anywhere in the country, spanning multiple sources of physical, forensic, and testimonial evidence collected over more than a decade. And he has kept nearly all of it in a personal notebook in his garage, because the professional world he has spent his life serving offers him no other place to put it. Grady's widow, whom Roy spoke with several times in the months following the deaths as part of the routine follow-up any officer conducts after a fatality on public land, never learned the full truth of what her husband had been attempting the night he died. Roy made a deliberate choice about that, one he has revisited many times since and has never fully settled in his own mind. The official account she received, consistent with the sheriff's classification of the case, was that Grady, Chester, and Milt had been out checking trail cameras and scouting for the upcoming bow season when they were attacked by an unidentified large predator, likely a transient black bear or bear-like animal, in a remote section of the National Forest. She was not told about the pup. She was not told about the Missouri buyer, or the 11 phone calls in the 3 weeks leading up to the abduction, or the abandoned mesh panel bent outward from the horse stall in the pole barn. Roy made the judgment, at the time, that she was already carrying enough grief, without also carrying the knowledge that her husband's death had been, in some meaningful sense, provoked by his own decision to steal an infant animal from its mother. He has wondered since whether that was the right call, whether withholding that context robbed her of information she had a right to have about her own husband's final hours, or whether it was, as he intended it, a small mercy extended to someone who had already lost more than enough. He has never resolved that question, and he has told us he does not expect to. Chester's widow, by contrast, pieced together more of the truth on her own than Roy ever offered her directly, largely because Milt, in the raw, unguarded state he was in during the days immediately following his rescue, said more to his own family than Roy's official version of events ever contained, and word travels between families in a community as small as the hollow outside 56, regardless of what any official report says. Roy does not know exactly how much Chester's widow understands about what actually happened, whether she has connected the abduction to the deaths in any complete way, or whether she has simply absorbed a garbled, partial version filtered through grief and rumor, the same way the 1970s sighting eventually reached Grady decades later, stripped of context and treated as local legend rather than documented fact. She has never contacted Roy directly to ask him what he knows. He has never volunteered it. That silence between two people who each hold a different fragment of the same tragedy is, in its own way, one more small example of the larger pattern running through this entire case. Everyone involved protecting themselves, or each other, or something else entirely. by simply not asking the questions whose answers they may not actually want. The Sylamore district today looks, to any ordinary visitor, exactly like what it has always been marketed as. A scenic stretch of Ozark National Forest, with a well-run show cave drawing tour groups through its illuminated passages. A clear, cold creek, popular with canoeists and trout fishermen, and a network of hiking trails maintained well enough that families with young children hike them every weekend without incident. None of that is false advertising. The overwhelming majority of the district's visitors will never come within miles of the specific hollow where this story took place, and even those who do will almost certainly never encounter anything beyond the ordinary wildlife any Ozark visitor should expect: deer, wild turkey, the occasional black bear moving through at a respectful distance. Roy wants that understood clearly, because he does not want this account, if it ever reaches an audience, to discourage anyone from experiencing a landscape he has spent his entire adult life protecting and loving. What he wants understood instead is something quieter and, in its own way, more difficult to sit with than a simple warning to stay out of the woods. Somewhere in that karst country, in cave systems that human explorers have spent decades mapping without ever finding their full extent, something intelligent, patient, and, until October of that year, almost entirely unprovoked in its dealings with the human beings sharing its territory, has been raising its young for longer than anyone can trace with any certainty. It asked nothing of the hunters, hikers, and canoeists who have passed within its range for generations. It asked nothing of the trail crew that saw it cross a fire road in the 1970s and was told to keep quiet about it. It asked nothing of Roy himself, across years of him walking directly into its territory with cameras and measuring tape, beyond the same distance and caution any wild animal defending a den would reasonably expect. It asked, in the end, for exactly one thing: that 3 strangers not climb into its home in the dark and take its child. Roy has come, in the years since, to think about that request in terms that surprised even him the first time the thought occurred to him, sitting alone in his truck on the fire road spur where Grady's abandoned vehicle was found, keys still in the ignition, the same spot where this entire investigation effectively began for him. He has spent a career enforcing laws designed to protect wildlife from exactly the kind of exploitation Grady attempted. Laws written by people who never imagined a species like this one might exist, who built an entire regulatory framework around protecting turkeys and deer and black bear and the occasional transient mountain lion, with no capacity whatsoever to extend that same protection to something the system refuses to acknowledge as real. In a strange, uncomfortable way, Roy has come to see what happened in that hollow as a kind of protection the law itself was never able to provide, delivered not by any statute or any officer with a badge, but by the animal itself, in the only language available to it, defending the one thing every legal framework Roy has ever sworn to uphold, claims to value most and consistently fails, in practice, to actually protect. That is not an endorsement of what happened. Roy has been careful, every time this conversation has come up, to make clear that he does not celebrate 2 men's deaths, however culpable their own choices made them. But he has stopped, somewhere along the way, viewing this case purely through the lens of tragedy, and started viewing it also through the lens of a mother, in a world that has given her exactly no institutional protection, doing what an institution should have done, and never had the chance to. The Arkansas Game and Fish Commission exists, in its entire founding purpose, to prevent exactly the kind of poaching and trafficking Grady attempted. It failed to prevent it here, not through negligence, but simply because it has no framework for a species it does not officially believe exists. Somewhere underneath all the grief and all the institutional silence and all the sealed reports sitting in filing cabinets across 3 different agencies, there is a version of this story that reads less like a horror account and more like the oldest story in the natural world. A parent doing whatever was necessary to bring her child home, in a system that offered her no other recourse, and would never, under any circumstances, have believed her case if she had somehow found a way to bring it before them. Roy retires in a little under 2 years now, a timeline he has mentioned to us more than once, always with the same faint, tired relief in his voice, the relief of a man who has carried something heavy for a long time and can finally see the point on the horizon where he will be allowed to set it down, at least in the professional sense, even if the private weight of it never fully leaves him. He plans to stay in Stone County. He has no interest in moving away from the district he has spent his entire career protecting, no interest in putting distance between himself and a landscape that, for all the specific and terrible weight of this one case, remains the place he loves more than anywhere else on earth. He will keep hiking those trails. He will keep fishing that creek. He suspects, though he has not said this outright, that some part of him will keep half listening, out of old habit, for a particular low, structured sound carrying across a hollow at dusk, the same sound. A neighbor's security camera caught 23 minutes of on a night that changed everything for 3 families in a hollow outside 56 Arkansas. He does not believe, and has never believed, that the animal responsible for what happened to Grady and Chester poses any ongoing threat to anyone who extends it the same basic respect any wild mother defending her young deserves. He believes it wants exactly what it has apparently wanted for as long as anyone can trace, going back through settler folklore and fragmentary indigenous tradition, and a nervous trail crew's unreported sighting in the 1970s, to be left alone, to raise its young in the deep limestone country it has occupied for longer than any official record can account for, to remain, as it has succeeded in remaining for generations before 3 men with a feed sack and a cattle prod briefly and catastrophically disrupted that arrangement. Invisible, the bluff shelter is still there, 400 vertical feet above Blanchard Springs Creek, reached by a spur road that has not seen regular maintenance in years and grows a little more overgrown with each passing season. The claw marks in the limestone at the back of the shelter are still there too, as far as Roy knows, weathering slowly the way stone weathers, a permanent record scratched into rock by something that has never been formally classified, never been officially acknowledged, and never been given a name beyond the one rural Arkansas has quietly used for 2 generations without ever quite deciding whether to believe in it. Somewhere in that watershed, in the cave systems beneath it that no one has ever fully mapped, something is still raising its young the way it has for longer than anyone can measure, asking nothing of the people who pass through its territory, except the one thing it has always asked, and the one thing that, for one terrible October, 3 men from a hollow outside 56 refused to give it. If you want to understand this landscape the way Roy understands it, you have to stand at the mouth of that shelter yourself, on a clear October evening, and watch the light go out of the hollow the way it does in that country. Fast, dropping behind the ridgeline all at once, rather than fading slowly the way it does over open ground. You have to feel the temperature drop 10 degrees in the space of 20 minutes, as the limestone gives back the day's heat and the creek far below starts to sound louder in the stillness. You have to sit with the knowledge that somewhere in the dark below you, or in a passage of unmapped cave running back into the mountain itself, something has been listening to you the entire time you thought you were listening to it. That is not a threat. Roy has been careful, every time this comes up, to insist it is not a threat. It is simply the truth of what that particular stretch of the Ozarks has apparently always been. Long before Arkansas was a state, long before the Osage were forced out of it, long before a radio prank in Michigan gave a name to something that had never needed one. A shared landscape, worked out over a very long time between people who mostly knew to leave certain hollows alone, and something that has never asked for anything more than exactly that. Grady, Chester, and Milt did not know that arrangement existed when they drove up that fire road with a livestock crate in the truck bed. By the time they learned it, for 2 of them, it was already too late. Roy has spent the years since trying to carry what he learned that October in a way that does not repeat the mistake, protecting a case file that officially does not exist, protecting a witness who will likely never fully recover, and protecting, as best he understands how, a mother and whatever family she is still raising in that limestone country. From ever having to make that choice again, there is one more detail from the immediate scene at Grady's property that Roy has never fully reconciled, something he documented at the time but did not fully understand the significance of until years later, once he had spent enough time studying the broader pattern across other regions to recognize what he was actually looking at. When he processed the barn the morning after the pup was reclaimed, he found, in addition to the bent mesh panel and the tracks crossing the pasture, a second, fainter set of prints along the fence line bordering the property. Smaller than the primary set, spaced closer together, moving parallel to the main trail, rather than directly toward the barn. At the time, working the scene alone under pressure to secure evidence before rain moved in that afternoon, Roy logged it as a possible secondary animal, likely a coyote or a second, smaller predator drawn by the commotion, and moved on to the more urgent work of documenting the primary track line. It was only much later, after piecing together the size variation Russ had documented in his own Michigan case, between what he believed were an adult and a younger, second individual using the same territory, that Roy went back to his own old field notes and reconsidered what that second, smaller track line at the fence might actually represent. He does not know for certain. He has never found a second confirmed print of that size anywhere else in the district in the years since. But he has come to suspect, cautiously, that the mother did not act alone that night, that a second animal, older offspring from a previous season perhaps, or another adult from the same family group, held position at the fence line while the primary animal went in for the pup. The same kind of coordinated positioning Kurt described from the Oregon logging site, and that Carl documented at the Umatilla depot, one individual holding a position while another executes the more direct action. If that reading is correct, it changes the shape of this story in a way Roy has sat with for a long time. It would mean the recovery of the pup was not simply one grieving mother acting on pure instinct in isolation, but a coordinated family response, planned and executed with a division of roles that implies communication and shared understanding between at least two individuals about what needed to happen and how. It would mean the population using that watershed is not just present, but socially organized in a way that mirrors exactly what Godfrey's decades of case files describe from other regions, family units working together, rather than solitary animals defending territory alone. Roy has no way to confirm this beyond his own retrospective reading of a 15-year-old field note, and he is careful, every time he discusses it, to flag it as his weakest and most speculative piece of evidence in the entire case. But he has also said, more than once, that it is the detail that changes how he thinks about the animal or animals in that hollow more than almost anything else he has documented. Not a solitary predator responding on pure instinct to a violated boundary, but a family, coordinating, the same way any family would, to bring a missing child home. The broader question of how many individuals actually occupy that watershed is one Roy has approached carefully and incompletely over the years, using the same methodology any wildlife biologist would apply to estimating a population of any elusive species, triangulating from track size variation, den site capacity, and the geographic spread of confirmed and suspected activity across the district. His best estimate, offered with significant caveats about the limitations of the data available to him, is a family group of somewhere between 3 and 5 individuals, likely spanning at least 2 generations, using a territory considerably larger than the immediate Blanchard Springs watershed and extending, based on the older reports he uncovered scattered across 15 years of departmental records, across a significant portion of the karst country running through the Sylamore district. That estimate places the Arkansas population within roughly the same range Russ documented for his Michigan territory over more than a decade of dedicated observation, and within the same general order of magnitude Carl's footage suggested for the population using the former Umatilla depot in eastern Oregon, a consistency across independently documented cases that Roy, cautious as he is about drawing broad conclusions from limited data, has found difficult to dismiss as coincidence. What that population size implies, if it holds up against future observation, is a species that is not simply surviving in isolated, precarious pockets, but reproducing successfully across multiple, independent territories spanning a continent's worth of forest, desert, and mountain terrain, each population adapted to its specific local environment while sharing the same fundamental behavioral architecture, avoidance as the primary strategy, restraint as the default response to human presence, and a capacity for decisive, coordinated, judgment-scaled violence held in reserve for exactly the kind of provocation that Grady, Chester, and Milt delivered to a family in a limestone hollow in rural Arkansas on one October night that none of them walked away from unchanged, and 2 of them did not walk away from at all. Roy's final thought, offered to us during our last conversation before we ended the call, was not about the evidence, or the institutional silence, or even about Milt, who Roy still checks in on periodically. A quiet, ongoing obligation Roy has never fully explained, even to himself, beyond a general sense that someone should. It was about the pup itself, the animal at the actual center of everything that followed, an infant creature that spent one terrifying night in a feed sack, a livestock crate, and finally a welded steel stall, handled roughly by strangers, crying out in a language none of them understood, before being retrieved by whatever came for it in the dark. Roy has wondered, more than once, what that single night did to an animal young enough that its entire understanding of the world was likely still being formed, whether it carries some version of what Milt carries, a wariness around anything resembling human structures or human scent that will shape its behavior for the rest of whatever life it has ahead of it in that watershed. There is no way to know. There is no way to ask. But Roy has said, more than once, that of everyone and everything touched by what happened in that hollow, the creature that suffered the actual abduction, the crating, the overnight captivity, and the terror of it all, is the one voice missing entirely from every account, every report, and every reconstruction anyone has ever been able to piece together, including his own. Roy keeps one photograph in that garage box separate from the rest, not filed with the track castings or the game camera stills, just tucked into the back cover of his notebook. It is not a photograph of anything supernatural. It is a photograph of the bluff shelter itself, taken on an ordinary afternoon, empty, sunlit, unremarkable to anyone who did not know what it was. He told us he keeps it there not as evidence, but as a reminder of what the whole case actually comes down to once you strip away the tracks and the reports and the sealed files. A den, a family, a place in the mountain that was never his to walk into, and that he has spent years since trying, in his own limited way, to leave exactly as undisturbed as it deserves to be. He does not know how much longer that shelter will sit undisturbed. He only knows that for now, on this side of the ridge, in this one hollow above Blanchard Springs, the mountain has kept its own counsel, and Roy intends to keep it that way for as long as the choice remains his to make.